Chapter 18. Castle in the Air. Higher and higher they climbed in search of the castle and the two banished princesses, from one crest to the next, from jagged rock to jagged rock, up frightful crumbling cliffs and along desperately narrow ledges, where a single misstep meant only goodbye. An ominous silence dropped like a curtain around them, and, except for the scuffling of their frantic footsteps, there wasn't a sound. The world that Milo knew was a million thoughts away, and the demons were there in the distance. "They're gaining!" shouted the humbug, wishing he'd never looked back. "But there it is!" cried Milo at the same instant, for straight ahead, climbing up from atop the highest peak, was a spidery spiral stair, and at the other end stood the castle in the air. I see it, said the happy bug as they struggled up the twisting mountain trail. But what he didn't see was that curled up right in front of the first step was a very little round man in a frock coat, sleeping peacefully on a very large and well-worn ledger. A long quill pen sat precariously behind his ear. There were ink stains all over his hands and face, as well as his clothing, and he wore a pair of the thickest eyeglasses that Milo had ever seen. "Be very careful," whispered Talk when they'd finally reached the top, and the humbug stepped gingerly around and started up the stairs. "Names?" the little man called out briskly, just as the startled bug reached the first step. He sat up quickly, pulled the book out from under him, put on a green shade, and waited with his pen poised in the air. "Well, stammered the bug. "Names?" he cried again, and as he did, he opened the book to page 512 and began to write furiously. The quill made horrible scratching noises, and the point, which was continually catching in the paper, flicked tiny ink blots all over him. As they called out their names, he noted them carefully in alphabetical order. "Splendid, splendid, splendid," he muttered to himself. "I haven't had an M in ages." "What do you want our names for?" asked Milo, looking anxiously over his shoulder. "We're in a bit of a hurry." "Oh, this won't take a minute," the man assured them. "I'm the official census taker. I must have some information before I can take your census. Now, if you'll just tell me where you were born, when you were born, why you were born, how old you are now, how old you were then, how old you'll be in a little while, your mother's name, your father's name, your aunt's name, your uncle's name, your cousin's name, where you live, how long you've lived there, the schools you've attended, the schools you haven't attended, your hobbies, your telephone number, your shoe size, shirt size, collar size, hat size, and the names and addresses of 6 people who we can get to verify all of this information. We'll get started. One at a time, please. Stand in line and no pushing, talking, or peeking." The humbug, who had difficulty remembering anything, went first. The little man leisurely recorded each answer in 5 different places, pausing often to polish his glasses, clear his throat, straighten his tie, and blow his nose. He managed also to cover the distressed bug from head to foot in ink. "Next," he announced very officially. "I do wish he'd hurry," said Milo, stepping forward, for in the distance he could see the first of the demons already beginning to scale the mountain toward them, no more than a few minutes away. The little man wrote with painful deliberation, finally finished with both Milo and Talk, and looked up happily. "May we go now?" asked the dog, whose sensitive nose had picked up a loathsome evil smell that grew stronger every second. "By all means," said the man agreeably, "just as soon as you finish telling me your height, your weight, the number of books you read each year, the number of books you don't read each year, the amount of time you spend eating, playing, working, and sleeping every day, where you go on vacations, how many ice cream cones you eat in a week, how far it is from your house to the barber shop, and which is your favorite color. Then after that, please fill out these forms and applications, 3 copies of each, and be careful, for if you make one mistake, you'll have to do them all over again." "Oh dear," said Milo, looking at the pile of papers. "We'll never finish these," and even as he spoke, the demons swarmed stealthily up the mountain. Come, said the census taker, chuckling gaily to himself. "Don't take all day. I'm expecting several more visitors any minute now." They set to work feverishly on all the difficult forms, and when they'd finished, Milo placed them all in the little man's lap. He thanked them politely, took off his eyeshade, put the pen behind his ear, closed the book, and went back to sleep. The humbug took one horrified look back over his shoulder and quickly started up the stairs. "Destination?" shouted the census taker, sitting up again, putting on his eyeshade, taking the pen from behind his ear, and opening the book. "But I thought," protested the astonished bug. "Destination," he repeated, making several notations in the ledger. "The castle in the air," said Milo impatiently. "Why bother?" said the census taker, pointing to the distance. "I'm sure you'd rather see what I have to show you." As he spoke, they all looked up, but Milo could only see the gay and exciting circus there on the horizon. There were tents and sideshows and rides and even wild animals, everything a little boy could spend hours watching. "And wouldn't you enjoy a more pleasant aroma?" he said, turning to talk. Almost immediately, the dog smelled a wonderful smell that no one but he could smell. It was made up of all of the marvelous things that had ever delighted his curious nose. "And here's something I know you'll enjoy hearing," he assured the humbug. The bug listened with rapt attention to something he alone could hear, the shouts and applause of an enormous crowd, all cheering for him. They stood as if in a trance, looking, smelling, and listening to the very special things that the census taker had provided for them, forgetting completely about where they were going and who, with evil intent, was coming up behind them. The census taker sat back with a satisfied smile on his puffy little face as the demons came closer and closer, until less than a minute separated them from their helpless victims. But Milo was too engrossed in the circus to notice, and Talk had closed his eyes the better to smell, and the bug, bowing and waving, stood with a look of sheer bliss on his face, interested only in the wild ovation. The little man had done his work well, except for some ominous crawling noises. Just below the crest of the mountain, everything again was silent. Milo, who stood staring blankly into the distance, let his bag of gifts slip from his shoulder to the ground, and as he did, the package of sounds broke open, filling the air with peals of happy laughter which seemed so gay at first that he, then Talk, and finally Humbug joined in. And suddenly the spell was broken. "There is no circus," cried Milo, realizing he'd been tricked. "There were no smells," barked Talk, his alarm now ringing furiously. "The applause is gone," complained the disappointed humbug. I warned you I was the census taker," sneered the census taker. "I help people find what they're not looking for, hear what they're not listening for, and run after what they're not chasing, smell what isn't even there. And furthermore," he cackled, hopping around gleefully on his stubby legs, "I'll steal your sense of purpose, take your sense of duty, destroy your sense of proportion, and, but for one thing, you'd be helpless yet." "What's that?" asked Milo fearfully. "As long as you have the sound of laughter," he groaned unhappily. "I cannot take your sense of humor, and with it, you've nothing to fear from me." "But what about them?" cried the terrified bug, for at that very instant, the other demons had reached the top at last and were leaping forward to seize them. They ran for the stairs, bowling over the disconsolate census taker, ledger, ink bottle, eyeshade, and all, as they went. The humbug dashed up first, then Talk, then lastly Milo, almost too late as a scaly arm brushed his shoe. The dangerous stairs danced dizzily in the wind, and the clumsy demons refused to follow, but they howled with rage and fury, swore bloody vengeance, and watched with many pairs of burning eyes as the three small shapes vanished slowly into the clouds. "Don't look down," advised Milo, as the bug tottered upward on unsteady legs. Like a giant corkscrew, the stairway twisted through the darkness, steep and narrow, with no rail to guide them. The wind howled cruelly in an effort to tear them loose, and the fog dragged clammy fingers down their backs, but up the giddy flight they went, each one helping others, until at last the clouds parted, the darkness fell away, and a glow of golden sun rays warmed their arrival. The castle gates swung open smoothly. They entered the great hall on a rug as soft as a snowdrift, and they stood shyly waiting. "Come right in, please. We've been expecting you," sang out two sweet voices in unison. At the far end of the hall, a silver curtain parted and two young women stepped forward. They were dressed all in white and were beautiful beyond compare. One was grave and quiet, with a look of warm understanding in her eyes, and the other seemed gay and joyful. "You must be the Princess of Pure Reason," said Milo, bowing to the first. She answered simply yes, and that was just enough. "Then you are Sweet Rhyme," he said, with a smile to the other. Her eyes sparkled brightly, and she answered with a laugh as friendly as the mailman's ring when you know there's a letter for you. "We've come to rescue you both," Milo explained seriously. "And the demons are close behind," said the worried humbug, still shaky from his ordeal. "And we should leave right away," advised Talk. "Oh, they won't dare come up here," said Reason gently, "and we'll be down there soon enough." "Why not sit for a moment and rest?" suggested Rhyme. "I'm sure you must be tired. Have you been traveling long?" "Days," sighed the exhausted dog, curling up on a large downy cushion. "Weeks," corrected the bug, flopping into a deep, comfortable armchair, for it did seem that way to him. "It has been a long trip," said Milo, climbing onto the couch where the princesses sat. "But we would have been here much sooner if I hadn't made so many mistakes. I'm afraid it's all my fault." "You must never feel badly about making mistakes," explained Reason quietly, "as long as you take the trouble to learn from them. For you often learn more by being wrong for the right reasons than you do by being right for the wrong reasons." "But there's so much to learn," he said with a thoughtful frown. "Yes, that's true," admitted Rhyme, "but it's not just learning things that's important. It's learning what to do with what you learn and learning why you learn things at all that matters." "That's just what I mean," explained Milo as Talk and the exhausted bug drifted quietly off to sleep. "Many of the things I'm supposed to know seem so useless that I can't see the purpose in learning them at all." "You may not see it now," said the Princess of Pure Reason, looking knowingly at Milo's puzzled face. "You may not see it now," said the Princess of Pure Reason, looking knowingly at Milo's puzzled face. "But whatever we learn has a purpose, and whatever we do affects everything and everyone else, if even in the tiniest way. Why, when a housefly flaps his wings, a breeze goes around the world. When a speck of dust falls to the ground, the entire planet weighs a little more. And when you stamp your foot, the earth moves slightly off its course. Whenever you laugh, gladness spreads like the ripples in a pond. And whenever you're sad, and no one anywhere can be really happy." And it's much the same thing with knowledge, for whenever you learn something new and whole, "You may not see it now," said the Princess of Pure Reason, looking knowingly at Milo's puzzled face. "But whatever we learn has a purpose, and whatever we do affects everything and everyone else, if even in the tiniest way. Why, when a housefly flaps his wings, a breeze goes around the world. When a speck of dust falls to the ground, the entire planet weighs a little more. And when you stamp your foot, the earth moves slightly off course. Whenever you laugh, gladness spreads like the ripples in a pond, and whenever you're sad, no one anywhere can be really happy. And it's much the same thing with knowledge, for whenever you learn something new, the whole world becomes that much richer. And remember also, added the Princess of Sweet Rhyme, that many places you would like to see are just off the map, and many things you want to know are just out of sight or a little beyond your reach. But someday you'll reach for them all, for what you learn today, for no reason at all, will help you discover all the wonderful secrets of tomorrow." "I think I understand," said Milo, still full of questions and thoughts. "But which is the most important?" At that moment, the conversation was interrupted by a far-off chopping noise. With each loud blow, the entire room and everything in it shook and rattled. Down below, on the murky peak, the demons were busily cutting the stairway loose with axes and hammers and saws. Before long, the whole thing collapsed with a tremendous crash, and the startled humbug leaped to his feet just in time to see the castle drifting slowly off into space. "We're moving!" he shouted, which was a fact that had already become obvious to everyone. "I think we had better leave now," said Rhyme softly, and Reason agreed with a nod.
"But how will we get down?"
groaned the humbug, looking at the wreckage below.
"There's no stairway, and we're sailing higher every minute."
"Well, time flies, doesn't it?" asked Milo. "On many occasions," barked Talk, jumping eagerly to his feet. "I'll take everyone down."
"Can you carry us all?"
inquired the bug. "For a short distance," said the dog thoughtfully. "The princesses can ride on my back, Milo can catch hold of my tail, and you can hang on to his ankles."
But what of the castle in the air?"
the bug objected, not very pleased with the arrangement. "Let it drift away," said Rhyme, "and good riddance," added Reason, "for no matter how beautiful it seems, it's still nothing but a prison." Talk then backed up the 3 steps and, with a running start, bounded through the window with all of his passengers and began the long glide down. The princesses sat tall and unafraid. Milo held on as tight as he could, and the bug swung crazily, like the tail on a kite. Down through the darkness they plunged, and to the mountains and the monsters below. Chapter 19. The Return of Rhyme and Reason. Sailing past 3 of the tallest peaks, and just over the outstretched arms of the grasping demons, they reached the ground and landed with a sudden jolt. "Quick!" urged Talk. "Follow me. We have to run for it." With the princesses still on his back, he galloped down the rocky trail, and not a moment too soon. For pounding down the mountainside in a cloud of clinging dust and a chorus of chilling shrieks came all the loathsome creatures who chose to live in ignorance and who had waited so very impatiently. Thick black clouds hung heavily overhead as they fled through the darkness, and Milo, looking back for just a moment, could see the awful shapes coming closer and closer. Just to the left, and not very far away, were the triple demons of compromise. One tall and thin, one short and fat, and the third exactly like the other 2. As always, they moved in ominous circles, for if one said here, the other said there, and the third agreed perfectly with both of them. And since they always settled their differences by doing what none of them really wanted, they rarely got anywhere at all, and neither did anyone they met. Jumping clumsily from boulder to boulder and catching hold with his cruel curving claws was the horrible hopping Hindsight, a most unpleasant fellow whose eyes were in the rear and whose rear was out in front. He invariably leaped before he looked, and he never cared where he was going as long as he knew why he shouldn't have gone to where he had been. And most terrifying of all, directly behind, inching along like giant soft-shelled snails, with blazing eyes and wet, anxious mouths, came the Gorgons of hate and malice, leaving a trail of slime behind them and moving much more quickly than you'd think. "Faster!" shouted Talk. "They're closing in!" Down from the heights they raced, the humbug with one hand on his hat and the other flailing desperately in the air, Milo running as fast as he'd never had run before, and the demons just a little bit faster than that. From off on the right, his heavy bulbous body lurching dangerously on the spindly legs which barely supported him, came the overbearing know-it-all, talking continuously. A dismal demon who was mostly mouth, he was ready at a moment's notice to offer misinformation on any subject. And while he often tumbled heavily, it was never he who was hurt, but rather the unfortunate person on whom he fell. Next to him, but just a little behind, came the gross exaggeration, whose grotesque features and thoroughly unpleasant manners were hideous to see, and whose rows of wicked teeth were made only to mangle the truth. They hunted together and were bad luck to anyone they caught. Riding along on the back of anyone who'd carry him was the threadbare Excuse, a small, pathetic figure whose clothes were worn and tattered and who mumbled the same things again and again in a low but piercing voice. Well, I've been sick, but the page was torn out. I missed the bus. No one else does it. Well, I've been sick, but the page was torn out. I missed the bus, but no one else does it. He looked quite harmless and friendly, but once he grabbed on, he almost never let go. Closer and closer they came, bumping and jolting each together, clawing and snorting their eager fury. Tox staggered along bravely with rhyme and reason. Milo's lungs now felt ready to burst as he stumbled down the trail, and the humbug was slowly falling behind. Gradually, the path grew broader and more flat as it reached the bottom of the mountain and turned toward Wisdom. Ahead lay light and safety, but perhaps just a bit too far away. And down came the demons from everywhere, frenzied creatures of darkness, lurching wildly toward their prey. From off in the rear, the terrible Trivium and the wobbly gelatinous giant urged them on with glee. And pounding forward with a rush came the ugly dilemma, snorting steam and looking intently for someone to catch on the ends of his long pointed horns, while his hooves bit eagerly at the ground. The exhausted humbug swayed and tottered on his rubbery legs, a look of longing in his anguished face.
I don't think I can,
he gasped as a jagged slash of lightning ripped open the sky and the thunder stole his words. Closer and closer the demons loomed as the desperate chase neared its end. Then, gathering themselves for one final leap, they prepared to engulf first the bug, then the boy, and lastly the dog and his two passengers. They rose as one and suddenly stopped, as if frozen in midair, unable to move, staring ahead in terror. Milo slowly raised his weary head, and there in the horizon, for as far as the eye could see, stood the massed armies of Wisdom, the sun glistening from their swords and shields, and their bright banners slapping proudly at the breeze. For a moment, everything was silent. Then 1,000 trumpets sounded, then 1,000 more, and, like an ocean wave, the long line of horsemen advanced, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until with a gallop and a shout, which was music to Milo's ears, they swept forward toward the horrified demons. There in the lead was King Azaz, his dazzling armor embossed with every letter in the alphabet, and with him the mathemagician, brandishing a freshly sharpened staff. From his tiny wagon, Dr. Discord hurled explosion after explosion to the delight of the soundkeeper, while the busy din collected them almost at once. And in honor of the occasion, Chroma, the Great, led his orchestra in a stirring display of patriotic colors. Everyone Milo had met during the journey had come to help. The men of the marketplace, the miners of Digitopolis, and all the good people from the valley and the forest. The spelling bee buzzed excitedly overhead, shouting, "Charge! C-H-A-R-G-E! Charge! C-H-A-R-G-E!" Canby, who, as everyone knew, was as cowardly as can be, came all the way from Conclusions to show that he was also as brave. And even Officer Shrift, mounted proudly on a long, low dashhound, galloped grimly along. Cringing with fear, the monsters of ignorance turned in flight and, with anguished cries, too horrible to ever forget, returned to the damp, dark places from which they came. The humbug sighed with relief, and Milo and the princesses prepared to greet the victorious army. "Well done," stated the Duke of Definition, dismounting and grasping Milo's hand warmly. "Fine job," seconded the Minister of Meeting. "Good work," added the Count of Connotation. "Congratulations," proposed the Earl of Essence. "Cheers," recommended the Undersecretary of Understanding. And since that's exactly what everyone felt like doing, that's exactly what everyone did. "It's we who should thank," began Milo when the shouting had subsided, but before he could finish, they had unrolled an enormous scroll. And with a fanfare of trumpets and drums, they stated in order that, henceforth and forthwith, let it be known by all men that rhyme and reason reign once more in wisdom. The two princesses bowed gratefully and warmly, kissed their brothers, and they all agreed at a very fine thing that had happened. And furthermore, continued the proclamation, the boy named Milo, the dog known as Talk, and the insect hereinafter referred to as the Humbug are hereby declared to be heroes of the realm. Cheer after cheer filled the air, and even the bug seemed a bit embarrassed at having so much attention paid to him. Therefore, concluded the Duke, in honor of their glorious deed, a royal holiday is declared. Let there be parades through every city in the land, and a gala carnival of 3 days' duration, consisting of jousts, games, feasts, and follies. The 5 cabinet members then rolled up the large parchment and, with many bows and flourishes, retired. Swift horsemen carried the news to every corner of the kingdom, and as the parade slowly wound its way through the countryside, crowds of people gathered to cheer it along. Garlands of flowers hung from every house and shop and carpeted the streets. Even the air shimmered with excitement, and shutters closed for many years were thrown open to let the brilliant sunlight shine where it hadn't shone in so long. Milo, Talk, and the very subdued Humbug sat proudly in the royal carriage with Azaz, the mathematician, the 2 princesses, and the parade stretched for miles in both directions. As the cheering continued, Rhyme leaned forward and touched Milo gently on the arm. "They're shouting for you," she said with a smile. "But I could have never done it," he objected, "without everyone's help." "That may be true," said Reason gravely, "but you had the courage to try, and what you can do is often simply a matter of what you will do." "That's why," said Azaz, "that there was one very important thing about your quest that we couldn't discuss until you returned." "I remember," said Milo eagerly. "Tell me now." "It was impossible," said the king, looking at the mathematician. "Completely impossible," said the mathematician, looking at the king. Do you mean?" stammered the bug, who suddenly felt a bit faint. "Yes, indeed," they repeated together. "But if we told you then, you might not have gone, and as you've discovered, so many things are possible just as long as you don't know they are impossible." And for the remainder of the ride, Milo didn't utter a sound. Finally, they'd reached a broad, flat plain midway between Dictionopolis and Digitopolis, somewhat to the right of the Valley of Sound, and a little to the left of the Forest of Sight. The long line of carriages and horsemen stopped, and the great carnival began. Gaily stripped tents and pavilions sprang up everywhere, as the workmen scurried about like ants. Within minutes there were racecourses and grandstands, sideshows and refreshment booths, gaming fields, Ferris wheels, banners, bunting, and bedlam, almost without pause. The mathematician provided a continuous display of brilliant fireworks made up of exploding numbers which multiplied and divided with breathtaking results. The colors, of course, being supplied by Chroma, and the noise by a deliriously happy Dr. Discord. Thanks to the soundkeeper, there was music and laughter, and, for very brief moments, even a little silence. Alex Bings set up an enormous telescope and invited everyone to see the other side of the moon, and the Humbug wandered through the crowd accepting congratulations and recounting in great detail his brave exploits, most of which gained immeasurably in the telling. And each evening, just at sunset, a royal banquet was held. There was everything imaginable to eat. King Azaz had ordered a special supply of delicious words in all flavors and, for those who liked exotic foods, in all languages too. The mathematician had provided innumerable platters of division dumplings, which Milo was very careful to avoid, for no matter how many you ate, when you finished there was more on your plate than when you began. And of course, following the meal came songs, epic poems, and speeches in praise of the princesses and the three gallant adventurers who had rescued them. King Azaz and the magician pledged that every year, at the same time, they would lead their armies to the mountains of ignorance until not one demon remained, and everyone agreed that no finer carnival for no finer reason had ever been held in wisdom. But even things as fine as all that must end sometime, and late on in the afternoon of the third day, the tents were struck, the pavilions were folded, and everything was packed ready to leave. "It's time to go now," said Reason, "for there is much to do." And as she spoke, Milo suddenly remembered his home. He wanted very much to go back, yet somehow he could not bear the thought of leaving. "And so you must say goodbye," said Rhyme, patting him gently on the cheek. "To everyone?" said Milo unhappily. He looked round slowly at all the friends he'd made, and he looked very hard, but so not as to forget any of them for even an instant. But mostly he looked at Talk and the humbug, with whom he had shared so much, the perils, the dangers, the fears, and best of all, the victory. Never had anyone had two more steadfast companions. "Can't you both come with me?" he asked, knowing the answer as he said it.
"I'm afraid not, old man," replied the bug. "I'd like to, but I've arranged a lecture tour which will keep me occupied for years."
"And they do need a watchdog here," barked Talk sadly. Milo embraced the bug, who, in his most typical fashion, was heard to mumble gruffly, "Bah!" but whose damp eyes told quite a different story. Then the boy threw his arms around Talk's neck and, just for a moment, held on very tightly. "Thank you for everything you've taught me," said Milo to everybody as a tear rolled down his cheek. "And thank you for what you've taught us," said the king, and as he clasped his hands, the little car was brought forward, polished like new. Milo got in with one last look, started down the road, with everyone waving him on. "Goodbye," he shouted. "Goodbye, I'll be back." "Goodbye," shouted Azaz. "Always remember the importance of words." "And numbers," added the math magician forcefully. "Surely you don't think numbers are as important as words," he heard Azaz shout from the distance. "Is that so?" replied the math magician a little bit more faintly. "Why, if—" "Oh dear," thought Milo, "I do hope they don't start it all again." And in a moment they had faded from sight as the road dipped, turned, and headed for home. Chapter 20. Goodbye and Hello. As the pleasant countryside flashed by and the wind whistled a tune on the windshield, it suddenly occurred to Milo that he must have been gone for several weeks. "I do hope that no one's been worried," he thought, urging the car on faster. "I've never been away this long before." The late afternoon sun had turned now from a vivid yellow to a warm, lazy orange, and it seemed almost as tired as he was. The road raced ahead in a series of gentle curves that began to look familiar, and off in the distance the solitary Tollbooth appeared, a welcome sight indeed. In a few minutes he reached the end of his journey, deposited his coin, and drove through. And almost before realizing it, he was sitting in the middle of his own room again. "It's only 6 o'clock, he observed with a yawn. And then, in a moment, he made an even more interesting discovery. "And it's still today! I've only been gone for an hour!" he cried in amazement, for he'd certainly never realized how much he could do in so short a time. Milo was much too tired to talk and almost too tired for dinner, so without a murmur he went off to bed as soon as he could. He pulled the covers around him, took a last look at his room, which somehow seemed very different than he'd remembered, and then drifted into a deep and welcome sleep. School went very quickly the next day, but not quickly enough, for Milo's head was full of plans, and his eyes could see nothing but the Tollbooth and what lay beyond. He waited impatiently for the end of class, and when the time finally came, his feet raced his thoughts all the way back to the house. Another trip, I'll leave right away. They'll all be so glad to see me, and I'll..." He stopped abruptly at the door of his room, for where the Tollbooth had been just the night before, there was now nothing at all. He searched frantically throughout his apartment, but it had vanished just as mysteriously as it had come, and in its place was another bright blue envelope, which was addressed simply, "For Milo, who now knows the way." He opened it quickly and read, "Dear Milo, you have now completed your trip courtesy of the Phantom Tollbooth. We trust that everything has been satisfactory and hope you understand why we had to come and collect it. You see, there are so many other boys and girls waiting to use it too. It's true that there are many lands you've still to visit, some of which are not even on the map, and wonderful things to see that no one has yet imagined. But we're quite sure that if you really want to, you'll find a way to reach them all by yourself. Yours truly." The signature was blurred and couldn't be read. Milo walked sadly to the window and squeezed himself into one corner of the large armchair. He felt very lonely and desolate as his thoughts turned far away. To the foolish, lovable bug, to the comforting assurance of Talk, standing next to him, to the erratic, excitable Din, to little Alec, who he hoped would someday reach the ground, to Rhyme and Reason, without whom wisdom withered, and to the many others he would remember always. And yet, even as he thought all of these things, he noticed somehow that the sky was a lovely shade of blue, and that one cloud had the pale shape of a sailing ship. The tips of the trees held pale young buds, and the leaves were a rich, deep green. Outside the window there was so much to see and hear and touch, walks to take, hills to climb, caterpillars to watch, as they strolled through the garden. There were voices to hear and conversations to listen and wonder, and the special smell of each day. And in the very room in which he sat, there were books that could take you anywhere, things to invent and make and build and break, and all the puzzle and excitement of everything he didn't know. Music to play, songs to sing, and worlds to imagine, and then someday make real. His thoughts started eagerly about as everything looked new and worth trying. "Well, I would like to make another trip," he said, jumping to his feet, "but I really don't know when I'll have time. There's just so much to do right here." And that's the end. Thanks for sticking around again, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it.